love, 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 love. It's a good way to start this talk about love and the Beatles and A Course in Miracles. Beatles were the band of love. You know, most of their songs, more than half of their songs, reference the word love in their songs. This is a fact. If you look at their catalog, the Beatles, I would say undisputably, in my mind at least, were the best band ever, and still to this day, right? They are better than the Stones, the Kinks, whatever band you want to bring up, Led Zeppelin, the Doors. Why is that? And I'll tell you one thing that is true from my own experience, which is when I was like 7 years old. My brother got the 67 to 70 album, and the Beatles, right? The greatest hits, and I totally was in love with that. I thought that was the coolest music, and what I would say is the Beatles had the ability to they had, because they had three great songwriters, and Ringo also, did some songs too, but maybe thankfully they didn't let him do too many songs, but George, Paul, and John were all brilliant songwriters. And not only that, but they were young kids, and they had the ability to appeal to and they were working with George Martin, who was older, right? So they had the ability to appeal to a wide range of people, from young people. If you listen to some of their songs, they're almost like children's songs, like Yellow Submarine, Octopus's Garden. A lot of them are so simple and so brilliant that they just appeal, and so melodic that they just appeal to a very wide range of people. And so that you hear, you know it's a Beatles song. You just hear a little bit of it. It may not even be the Beatles doing it. It might be someone else doing it, but it's like the Beatles are so ingrained in our culture by this point that it's hard not to know a Beatles song. If you don't, you've been living under a rock or something. But which brings me to this quote from John Lennon that we'll start with here. This is in 1966. John Lennon said, "We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity." This is 66, right? This is what got him in trouble. This is people said this is the moment that basically ended Beatlemania. The Beatles, at least in the United States, were suddenly became went from being idolized to being demonized, not by everyone, of course, but by the the fundamentalist people in the United States, which I'm sure at that time there were more than there are now. Maybe not. I don't know. But in England, it didn't. That quote didn't get them in trouble, but it got them in trouble in the States. And there were actually album burnings. People burned the Beatles albums. It was said to have marked the semi-official end of Beatlemania. It was known as the bigger than Jesus. That people said that John was saying we're bigger than Jesus. He said we're more popular than Jesus now, which is not true. There's literally like 1 billion Christians in the world. I don't think that there are 1 billion Beatles fans necessarily, although when you look at it, it could be true that the Beatles have, like if you take the 1 billion Christians, let's say there's 1 billion or 2 billion Christians in the world, I don't know what the number is. We live in a world of 8 billion plus people at this point. There's how many Buddhists, how many Hindus, how many a billion Hindus, a billion Buddhists, a billion Christians, a billion Muslims, 20 million Jews, 30 million Jews, however many. But if you take the billion of people, do they all really believe in Jesus, or do they really follow Christianity? They might consider themselves Christian, but do they really follow it? And if you take those people and you ask them to recite lines from the Bible, they might be more able to recite Beatles lyrics than they would the Bible, right? And I think so. In a sense, what John was saying there is, he was kind of right about that. He was right in the sense that in that time period, people knew the Beatles and their music better than they did the Bible, right? Most people don't read the Bible. That's the thing. They don't even know what Jesus said. So he wasn't wrong to say that. And I think that thing about, I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. We could say, well, I don't know what will go first, the Beatles or Christianity. The Beatles' music is going to be around for a long time. It may be in 1,000 years from now, or 2,000 years from now, the Beatles will be a religion, right? We don't know. I think there's something to be said for that idea, right? That the Beatles, there still are two surviving members of the Beatles. I wrote a book about Jim Morrison where it talked about the mythology of Jim Morrison, and how after his death, even during his life, he was a legend, and after he died, the myths and the legends just grew. And I think the same will be true with the Beatles. So it's going to be interesting, not that we're going to be around to see it, but it'll be interesting to know what life will be like 2,000 years from now, and what spirituality and religion will be like. Of course, we're not going to be around, but I think the thing also. Well, all right. Let me slow down a little. Let me introduce myself. My name is Alawa. My name is actually Alan. I go by Alawa. That's my pen name. I have a bunch of books out on Amazon. I just did a translation of the Bhagavad Gita. I'm ready to write a book about the Beatles, about the subject I'm going to talk about right now. I'm talking off the cuff. I haven't prepared anything. If you want me to prepare something, if you want me to write a book, then help fund me to write it, and I will do it. It's difficult to do that kind of thing without some kind of funding, without some kind of people supporting you. So if you want a better video than this one, I will prepare it, but I would need some funding to help do it. I think this video is going to be good though, because I'm going to cover a lot of interesting stuff, and I'm gonna compare the Beatles. Not compare, but I'm going to draw the interesting parallels between the Beatles and A Course in Miracles. The first thing I'll say is the Beatles were a 60s phenomenon, 1960s, right? They started, the late 50s, like 50, 59, 58, 59, and they were finished by 69. They didn't last after the 60s. So that's the first thing I think that's very interesting. And A Course in Miracles also began in the 60s, 1965. Probably the seeds of it were even before 65. I mean, most definitely the seeds were growing. 65 is when Helen Schuckman actually started to scribe it. And she was actually done in 72. So it was also a 60s phenomenon. The Course in Miracles is a 60s phenomenon. A lot of interesting things were happening during the 60s, and that was one of them. This is a new scripture. This is a scripture that, is also probably going to grow in popularity over time. Once people know what it is and understand it and begin to, really engage with it, it will have, I'm sure, millions of followers as well. Not probably as much as the Beatles, maybe not as much as Christianity, but although in time maybe it will. Let's keep in mind that A Course in Miracles is also a scripture that was given through Jesus. This is the understanding that Helen had, that Jesus was actually dictating the course to her. Except the difference is that A Course in Miracles is not a religion. It's not an institution. It's not a dogma. It's not a doctrine. It does not have the institutionalized aspect that Christianity has come to have. So, and that's a very big important part of it, is that it's meant to be, and some people disagree with this, but I think how Helen understood it was that it was not a cult. It wasn't not a religion. This is A Course in Miracles is a way for the individual to get in touch with their higher self, right? Which the Course calls the Holy Spirit. And it's not meant to be a dogma that someone, is like, this is exactly what A Course in Miracles says, and you have to believe this, otherwise you are not a true believer. A Course in Miracles does not have that kind of catechism or doctrine. It's not doctrinal. It's really open to each person's understanding and interpretation. People would also quibble with what I just said, but there are some people that said, well, there's only one right interpretation of A Course in Miracles, and that could be so, but there's not one right interpretation for every person at any given time, and I think that's what we have to, what A Course in Miracles is trying to help us to understand, is that not everyone may be at your level of understanding what you think you are, and you may think you have the right interpretation, but maybe you need to question your own. If you're holding a judgment against others because of your interpretation, maybe that's something you need to look at. With that said, let's get back to the Beatles. I want to talk about some of the major things that transpired in the Beatles' history that are very interesting to look at. I'm not going to probably touch on everything, but I'm going to touch on the things that I'm really the most aware of. The first thing is this idea of Beatlemania. Beatlemania was really up until the early 60s to the mid 60s. I think it was really from like 63 to 66, or maybe 62, 63 to 66. That was all the Beatles' early songs that were all about like love and relationships, and weren't as musically interesting and deep, you could say, as their later songs, although some people would say, would also argue with, have a problem with what I just said, but the Beatles' early music was wonderful, and it was lively, and it was really cool, great harmonies, brilliant songwriting and chord progressions, but I think most people would agree that their later music was more interesting on a number of levels, and they get better with time, right? They really especially when they stopped touring and they started to focus just on making studio albums with George Martin, their albums became more and more interesting, and that's what I thought as a kid too. When I thought, well, their early music was cool, but but like I Am the Walrus and later Sergeant Pepper, Revolver on, basically maybe a little before Revolver, was their psychedelic phase. So let's just talk about the Beatlemania just for a second, which is that the Beatles were basically a religious revival. From if you look at the concerts with the kids that are screaming, especially the young girls that are like out of their minds with whatever, they're in ecstasy, or they're having some kind of Kundalini awakening, or whatever it might be, by listening to the Beatles. It's fascinating, right? It's, the Beatles had a lot of what in Hinduism is called Shakti. They had the Shakti, they had the energy, they had the prana Shakti. They could move the energy, right? They had a certain power that generally you would only find in a church or in a temple or religious institution. And that was what I think also what John was getting at there, is that the Beatles were changing lives with their music. People were having ecstatic, probably spiritual awakenings from listening to the Beatles, or going to a Beatles concert, or just playing the Beatles on the record player. So that's one thing, right? The Beatlemania. Around that time that the Beatlemania ended, when John said that, right around that time is when the Beatles' dentist invited them over to dinner and slipped LSD into their tea. I think this was like 65, 66 maybe. We'd have to look at the exact date when I could look it up right now, but it was probably around 66. LSD had already become big, especially in the United States, in the early 60s, from like 61 or 62 on. And bands in the States probably were more into it before the Beatles. I don't know when the Grateful Dead basically, kind of started around the same time as the Beatles. I would say the Grateful Dead, the only possibly runner-up to the greatest band of all time would be the Grateful Dead. Their name is like G-D, God. They also were like a religion. They also had like a cult following. Other bands do have that too, of course. But the Grateful Dead, like the Beatles, were kind of like the first of their kind. They were the ringleader. They were the innovator. Many jam bands have come and gone. The Dead are still playing, right? The Dead, even without Garcia, probably when all the members of the Dead are gone, the Dead will continue, right? John Mayer will be running the show probably. We'll see what happens, but the Dead, in a way, the Beatles are not going to be a band, right? They're not a band right now. The Grateful Dead is continuing. Will the Rolling Stones continue? I don't know. We'll see what happens. But it's hard to think of the Rolling Stones without Mick Jagger and without Keith Richards. But anyway, let's go on. So Beatlemania, and then the Beatles took LSD, right? Their dentist slipped it into their tea. They all tripped out. They went to this nightclub and they started to really trip out. And then really George, they all took LSD after that. Paul said some good things, even to the press, about LSD, about them taking LSD, and how LSD made him a better person, a better citizen. He said some good things about LSD, in support of LSD at that time. This is like 66 or probably 66, right? George and John were the ones that really took more LSD than anyone else in the band. John claimed in like 70 or 71, when he did an interview in Rolling Stone with Jan Wenner, he said that he took LSD 1,000 times. And Jan Wenner was like, do you mean literally 1,000 times? He's like, at least 1,000 times, maybe more than 1,000 times. And he said, yeah, literally. He was taking it all the time in those years. So he must have done it, to do it 1,000 times in just a few years, 66, 67, 68, he must have done it almost every day. Or done multiple doses a day, which seems improbable. So it seems like that was a little bit of a stretch, but even so, he took it a lot, right? And that's why it's hard to believe that LSD did not influence his songwriting and his and the music of the Beatles. I think it did. I don't think you can, even though he said Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was not about acid, it clearly is. And it clearly is, it shows up in all of their, not all of their, but a lot of their later music. But it also, you have to keep in mind that the term acid rock, there is a term for it. Acid rock was a thing at that time. So all the bands were kind of swimming in the same pool, so to speak. So they were, even if you didn't take acid, even if you didn't take LSD, you were influenced by these other bands that were writing songs in that vein, in that genre. John Lennon also said that the Rolling Stones really were copying the Beatles, which could be true, right? I don't know if the Stones were as much into LSD as George Harrison and John Lennon were, but that's another topic that we could talk about. But keep in mind, so the other thing, is that Helen Schuckman started scribing A Course in Miracles right at this time, 65, when maybe Beatlemania was really at its height. So that's an interesting thing right there. Also, the rise of LSD was at its height. This was probably right before LSD was made illegal in the United States. So that's an interesting thing, right? It's an interesting fact. Factoid. Now, the Beatles started taking LSD, and then they disavowed, by just in a couple of years, they basically disavowed it. They said they started to say things like, we're past LSD now, we've moved on, right? We're looking for something else. And this was not just them. Other people were saying this a lot. The Flower Children, the hippies, were collectively moving on from psychedelics, it seemed. Not all of them, but there was this movement in the world of hippies. Some were saying, I love my LSD, I'm staying with it. And others were saying, this can't be the answer because you need to keep taking this. So the Beatles were looking for a natural way. And so they went to India and they did a meditation retreat with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who is the founder of Transcendental Meditation. And they were basically, I think, they might have been in Nepal, or they were in North India, staying at his retreat. I forget if it was in Nepal or India, but it was basically the Beatles go to India. They're trying to see if meditation is the way, is if they want to get behind meditation to help the world. I think at the basis of their thought, their thinking was, we have so much power, we want to put our star power behind something that's going to help humanity. And I credit that to the Beatles. I think the Beatles, that was very cool of them to have that intention, right? That they were like, we can actually help planet Earth. We can actually help humanity, not only through our music, but through what we are choosing ourselves as individuals and as a band. And it was cool that they went there together as a band, right? It was like they're gonna see if this meditation thing can really help humanity. But the interesting thing about it is that they thought that Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was sleeping with one of their women. I personally think there was more going on, but the official story is that they left early and they basically said, we're not doing this. Soon, very soon, bud. Give me 5 more minutes, bud. I will. I'll be right up. Yeah. So so that was short-lived. But George and John were. I would say that George and John were really the seekers, the spiritual seekers of the band. I did another video, by the way, where I talked about how they later went to meet Srila Prabhupada came to see them in London, and they had a talk with him, and he told them all about the Hare Krishna movement, and the Hare Krishna movement also started in '66 in New York City. So these are all happening at the same time. The Hare Krishna movement, which is now a big worldwide movement. Of Course in Miracles, not probably as big as the Hare Krishna movement, but it's also very big. And we'll have to talk about it. But I don't think John and George knew about A Course in Miracles yet, because it wasn't published yet. I'm curious if they learned about, because John was living in New York City when A Course in Miracles came out. So I'm interested to find out if John knew about A Course in Miracles when it came out, if he had heard about it, and what he thought about it. I'm going to look into that, and I'll get back to you on that. I'm pretty sure he knew about it. You know, it was a phenomenon. When it came out, people were talking about it, and it became very quickly a big thing. Just like the Hare Krishna movement started with this one guy in New York City. He had no money, Srila Prabhupada, and he created this huge movement in a very short amount of time. So it's fascinating how it all happened. Srila Prabhupada, who was also called Swami Bhaktivedanta, comes to London to talk to the Beatles, but it's really only George and John and Yoko who are there, and there's some other Hare Krishnas in the room. And Srila Prabhupada is telling them about how great Hare Krishna is, how great Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON, is the name of the group, the International Society of Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON. So he's talking to them all about Krishna consciousness. And John and Yoko really didn't go for it, right? They had too many questions, whereas George ended up becoming a Hare Krishna till the end of his life. And it was there was that incident where someone got into his house and threatened to kill him, and he I forget exactly what happened, but George, this is in like the 90s, and George began saying the Hare Krishna mantra because he thought he was going to die. So he was a Hare Krishna until the end of his life, and he famously did the song "My Sweet Lord," which was all about Krishna. I really want to see you. I really want to, my sweet Lord. And he was a very big supporter of the Hare Krishna movement, whereas the other Beatles, since, especially Paul and Ringo, have been supporters of transcendental meditation. So they kind of sided more with the transcendental meditation, although I don't think I'm not sure if they're practitioners themselves, but they've done benefit concerts for TM. I don't think they've done much for the Hare Krishna movement, although I could be wrong about that. That's something else to look into. So what else do we want to say about this? So George became a Hare Krishna, which I think is fascinating. And he was one of the people that really put the kirtan music. Kirtan is a practice, bhakti practice from India. Bhakti is devotional singing in a group, and he did some songs even when the Beatles were together, he was playing the sitar. He was learning from Ravi Shankar. He was into Indian spirituality before he became a Hare Krishna. The other Beatles, maybe not as much, but George kind of was more on that path earlier than the other Beatles. And he was one of the first people to bring in the sitar into popular music, into rock music. I think the Doors, Robbie Krieger was also learning from Ravi Shankar, as I understand it, and some other rock musicians at the time were learning sitar from Ravi Shankar. I believe this was in the Los Angeles area. I could be wrong. Another thing to look into. But so then the Beatles broke up. They all went their merry ways. Obviously, Paul and Ringo, as far as I'm aware, never joined any kind of religion or spiritual group. John didn't really either. He and Yoko remained unattached, but clearly John was a seeker, right? He was really on the path. He found he stopped taking LSD because he started to have bad trips. He started to have, he said, his trips started getting very scary and very, very traumatic, and he stopped taking it, and he started to do something called primal scream therapy that was developed by this guy named Arthur Janov. And he and Yoko began to do that, and they found it very effective. So they were definitely, seeking spiritual awareness and healing or understanding, just not in a institutional way. And John wrote the song God, which is kind of his disavowal of traditional religion and also of the Beatles. He's basically saying the Beatles are over, the dream's over. I think he was seeking to the end of his life, I'm sure, right? So what do we have to say? Now let's bring in A Course in Miracles. I think John was getting the closest, from my understanding, I think John was getting the closest to what A Course in Miracles is saying. And John had some quotes about how the Christians from the very beginning didn't understand Jesus. Jesus was beyond their understanding that they were misinterpreting what he said, and so we don't have the true teachings of Christ, and that's what A Course in Miracles purports to be. Is this is the deeper message of Christ. This is what Christ was really teaching 2,000 years ago, but people did not. His apostles did not understand it, and they were even misinterpreting what he was saying. And that's why you can't necessarily follow the Gospels, or if you do, you have to understand it in a deeper way, right? You can't read them at face value. And I think John understood that, and John was getting, he was at that point where he had really questioned. He had questioned as far as he could, right? And he was getting to the point of basically, I think he was getting maybe to a nihilistic place. Maybe that's why he began to have these bad trips. I think he was getting to a place of the dissolution of the ego. And maybe he was not completely ready to go there. That's my sense, is that he was getting to that point, but he was not fully ready to go all the way with that. I could be wrong. But A Course in Miracles is really a document for those. It's for anyone and everyone, but it's also for those who want to go all the way, right? to to realize their self, the true self, right? To realize the truth of reality. That's what A Course in Miracles is in essence. Now, the Beatles, as I said at the beginning, they were all about love. I would say that's what A Course in Miracles is all about as well. Is it's a path to love. The Beatles had a really cool song early on called "The Word." I think it was written by John Lennon. The word is love, right? Say the word and you'll be free. It's actually a really brilliant song, and it shows how deep John Lennon really was, and that I think that the Beatles really, in many ways, you could read a Course in Miracles in light of the Beatles, or vice versa, right? That they really support each other in many ways, and in many ways, I would say, again, I don't think from my understanding, I'm not sure if any of the Beatles fully realized the self, right? I'm not sure if they went all the way. But collectively speaking, and what they did as a band, and what they, I think they were a very powerful force, and that they have had a very positive, for the most part, influence on helping people to return home to their true self. If only in the sense that listening to their music makes people feel good, and makes people feel a certain joy that they can't feel all the time from other things. In a way, it's like a drug, right? But in a way, ultimately, you don't need music, you don't need the Beatles, but it can be helpful. Just like LSD could be helpful, just like primal scream therapy can be helpful, just like external religion, the external rules and regulations and trappings of religion can be helpful. But ultimately, it's all an inside job, and you can't rely on anything external, because it's all in your own mind. It's all up to your own choice. And I think the Beatles were pointing to that, right? And maybe one of the most profound songs that they did. Well, there's a lot of songs that you could point to. Tomorrow Never Knows, which was based on John Lennon's reading of Timothy Leary's kind of like the acid Book of the Dead that he wrote, which really is a very profound song. I Am the Walrus, All Across the Universe. So many John Lennon songs, while the Beatles were still together, were getting very close to what A Course in Miracles is saying. But A Course in Miracles, I think I'll end with this. A Course in Miracles is unique. A Course in Miracles is presenting something that you really cannot find elsewhere, and you can only say that. You can ask that question that John asked. What's going to last? The Beatles, obviously, the music is temporary. It's all part of this illusionary world. If you look at it in light of A Course in Miracles, it's all illusion. It's all just ways of pointing to the eternal truth of reality. But the Beatles' music will be around, I'm sure, for a very long time, maybe longer than certain aspects of Christianity. And I think there's a very good case to be made, which I will do at some point, that Jesus, there was not a historical Jesus, that Jesus was a myth, based in the Jewish sources, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. But Jesus as a myth was real. Like it is a reality. It's just not a historical reality. And that's I think what we might begin to see more of as time goes by. That we might see more of an understanding of that, less of a literal understanding of Jesus and the Gospels, and more of a metaphysical and mystical understanding and mythical understanding, which goes deeper. Like, because you can read the literal and the and things at face value, but that's not going to take you as deep as if you get into a deeper, right? And I think that the Beatles music does have the ability to transport you beyond the three-dimensional reality to a certain degree, especially if you listen to it under the right circumstances. I don't want to say under the right drugs, but maybe that too. Let's end with I hope you found this helpful. And like I said, there's a book to be written here. I'm sure someone has written it already, but I just haven't written a book about it. But I'd be happy to do it. I would need some funding to do it. So far, none of my books have really sold much. I haven't made too much money. I've put a lot of time into them and have not seen much return on the physical, material level. But, one of these days I'm sure that will change. But love, 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 love. Love, 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 love. See you soon. What can we say to end here? Roll over Beethoven. Roll over Jesus. No, Jesus is risen. You can't roll over. All right. Well, we'll see you soon. Rock on.